Hi, welcome to my channel, Math Made Easy with Laurel. I'm Laurel, and in this video we're going to talk about markup. When you're talking about markup, you might encounter a lot of different formulas. I'm going to try to keep formulas to a minimum and really focus on understanding how these amounts are all related to each other. So a retailer will determine the selling price of an item based on the cost of the item, so what they pay the wholesaler, what they actually pay for the item, plus the expenses, also called overhead, which may include wages, rent for a building, insurance, and so on, plus profit. So when we add the expenses and the profit to the cost, that determines the selling price. Another term that we can use to represent expenses plus profit is markup amount. So the selling price will equal the cost plus the markup amount. Or expenses plus profit equals markup amount. When talking about this markup amount, we often want to express it as a percent, and there are two ways that it can be expressed as a percent. So it's either based on the cost, in which case it's called the percent markup, or it's based on the selling price, in which case it's called the percent margin. Let's take a look at an example. The cost of an item is $30, it sells for $50. What is the percent markup and what is the percent margin? So let's define what each of those is and then let's calculate. So if you're asked to find percent markup, that is found by taking the amount of markup divided by the cost and times 100 to change it to a percent. So markup is based on the cost of the item. On the other hand, percent margin is based on the selling price. So to find the percent margin, you take that same amount of markup, but then you divide by the selling price and then multiply by 100. So whether we're finding percent markup or percent margin, we need to find the amount of markup. So the way that we find that is simply taking the selling price and subtracting the cost. So in our example, it would be $50 minus $30, which is $20. So if we're calculating the percent markup, we're finding what percent 20 is out of the cost, which is 30. Is 66.67%. On the other hand, if we were finding the percent margin, we would take that same amount of markup, but this time we're going to divide by the selling price. We're going to find what percent this amount of markup is of the selling price of $50, which is 40%. There's a lot of different types of questions that you're going to encounter around markup, so let's just keep going through examples to show some of the things you might see. Next example, a company determined that expenses average 22% of the product cost and profit averages 18% of the product cost. It buys a product from its supplier for a MSRP, manufacturer suggested retail price, of $25 less a trade discount of 40%. What will be the regular selling price? So we're going to use selling price equals cost plus expenses plus profit. We're finding selling price. We can write expenses in terms of cost. We can write profit in terms of cost, but we don't know what the cost is. If we take $25 minus a discount of 40%, we can find cost. So we can either find 40% of 25 and subtract it, or we can just do it with this formula, which is what we learned in our last video on discounts. So do the subtraction. 1 minus 0.4 is 0.6. Multiply 0.6 times 25, it's 15. Another way that you can think of it is if they get a discount of 40%, then they're actually only paying 60% of $25. So there's our cost. Expenses are 22% of the cost. So we can write that as 0.22 times 15. Profit is 18% of the cost. So 18% times 15. And when we add those all up, that should give us our selling price. If you want these values separately, this is $330, This is $2.70. When we add all this together, we get a selling price of $21. So the company's cost is $15 and the selling price is $21. Now let's find percent markup and percent margin. In order to find percent markup, we take our amount of markup. Amount of markup is selling price minus cost, so 21 minus 15, which is 6. Now we find what percent that amount of markup is based on cost to find percent markup. So 6 divided by 15, multiplied by 100, and we get 40%. Percent margin is done much the same way, except we don't use the cost as our base. We have to use our selling price. So it's going to be 6 divided by 21 times 100, which is 28.57%. Our next example says a company knows that its profits are 15% of the selling price and expenses are 25% of cost. So you have to be careful here. The profits are based on selling price and expenses are based on cost. What is the cost of an item that has a selling price of $75? So let's plug in the values that we know, and we're finding the cost, so that's going to be our unknown, and we're going to try to write everything else in terms of values we know or in terms of C. Selling price. We know the selling price is $75. Cost, we don't know. I don't know expenses, but I do know expenses are 25% of the cost. So I can write that as 25% of C, which is 0.25 times C. Then the profit, we don't know what it is, but we know that profit is 15% of the selling price. So we're going to write 15% of the selling price, which is $75. Now let's clean this up a little bit. I'm going to calculate this value, and I'm going to combine these two terms. So C plus 0.25C, that's like a 1C, plus 0.25C gives me 1.25C. 0.15 times 75 is 11.25. Now I'm going to subtract 11.25 from both sides of the equation because I want this by itself. When I subtract 11.25 from 75, I get 63.75, and when I subtract it from this side of the equation, it's gone. Now in order to solve for C, I'm going to divide both sides by 1.25. And my answer for cost is $51. So be very careful with the terminology and understand when you're given a percent, is that percent based on the selling price or the cost? Because it could be either. Our next example says the markup on a pair of jeans is 60% of the cost. If the jeans cost $50, what is the selling price? So in order to solve this, you can think of it in terms of this formula. The selling price will equal the cost plus the amount of markup. So selling price is what we're finding. Cost is $50. The amount of markup will be 60% of the cost, so 60% of the cost. So we would get a selling price of $80. Let's take a look at how you would handle this if you were given the selling price and asked to find the cost. So the markup on a pair of jeans is still 60% of the cost, but this time we know the selling price is $80 and we want to find the cost. So we plug in $80 for selling price. We don't know what the cost is, and the markup is 60% of the cost. So we combine these two terms. 1C plus 0.6C is 1.6C. Divide both sides by 1.6. And we get cost of $50. Next example says the margin on a set of headphones is 32%. If the cost of the headphones is $120, what is the selling price? So let's figure out what we know, and let's figure out what 32% is based on. We know the cost is $120. We don't know the selling price. And the amount of markup, because this is margin, that 32% is based not on the cost, but on the selling price. So that's going to be 32% or 0.32 times the selling price. Let's subtract this term from both sides. So we've got S minus 0.32S will equal 120. That's like 1s minus 0.32s, which is 0.68s, equals 120. And let's divide both sides by 0.68. So the selling price for those headphones would be $176.47. We could check this because we could find 32% of this and subtract it and see if that equals our cost. So pay really close attention to the wording in these questions and also understand what you use as the base when you're finding a percentage of something. In our last example, it says a shoe store orders a specific runner at a suggested retail price of $178 less the trade discounts of 25% and 10%. The shoes will be sold at the manufacturer's suggested retail price, which is $178. If the overhead expenses are 20% of the selling price, what will be the operating profit on each pair of runners? So in our formula, we're going to be finding profit, so we need to know these other values. We know the selling price is given as $178. The cost to the store will be $178 minus the successive discounts of 25% and 10%. If you saw my previous video on discounts, the way that we're going to find that cost is we're going to take selling price times it by 1 minus this first discount of 25% times 1 minus the second discount of 10%. Simplifying this, we get 0.75. Simplifying this, we get 0.9. And when we multiply all of this together, we get $120.15. This is what the store pays, so that's the cost, $120.15. Now let's find expenses. They're 20% of the selling price, so 20% of 178. And now we can find profit. 0.2 times 178 is 35.60. When we add these two amounts together, we get 155.75. And then to solve for P, I just subtract 155.75 from both sides. So profit is 22.25. The next part of the question asks, what is the rate of markup on the cost? Before we find the rate of markup, which is a percent, we need to find the amount of markup. And the way that we do that is we take the selling price of 178, subtract the cost of 120.15. So the amount of markup is $57.85. So we want to find what percent that is based on the cost. So the rate of markup is the percent markup. It's going to be the amount of markup of $57.85 divided by the cost times 100. So the percent markup is 48.15%. The next part of the question says, what's the rate of markup based on the selling price? So in other words, we're finding the percent margin. We find that by taking the amount of markup again, but this time we divide by the selling price. Percent margin is based on selling price, percent markup is based on cost. So our percent margin would be 32.5%. And the last part to this question says, what would be the break-even selling price for an inventory clearance? So the break-even price would just be the cost and expenses. We know the cost of the shoes is $120.15. The expenses, we calculated it earlier, was 20% of the selling price, so 20% of 178. 0.2 times 178 is 35.60, so when we add these, we get a break-even selling price of $155.75. Another way we could have found the break-even selling price is we could have taken the selling price of 178 and subtracted the profit that we found in part A of 22.25, and that would give us the same value as well. So the important thing when you're doing all of these calculations is when you're dealing with the percents, understand what the percent is based on. Is that particular percent based on the cost or on the selling price? And know the difference between the amount of markup and the rate of markup. And there's two different rates. One is based on the cost, which is called the percent markup, and the other is based on the selling price, and that is called percent margin. I hope this helps.